Good morning to you all. My name is Jerry Power and I'm your host for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. The webinar series will be an ongoing feature of Emergence Education Initiative to build the cyber knowledge of our broker partners. We have a big audience today with approximately 900 brokers listening in, which gives you an insight into how important cyber is as an issue for the insurance industry and for business. I'm pleased to advise all attendees will be entitled to 1 CPD point. Today, we would like to share with you our insights into cyber as a significant risk for business, how criminals are targeting various industries, share with you what we're seeing from the claims we are managing and how claims trends are evolving, the looming issue of legislative change in Australia, and finally, I'll provide you with an update on how Emergence is growing and building its capabilities. We plan for the webinar to go for 50 minutes with an additional 10 minutes for Q&A. Our promise to you is we will wrap this up in an hour so you can get back to your business. If you want to post a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A button on your screen and we will try and answer as many questions as possible in the Q&A session. So as you can see, we've got plenty to share with you today, so let's get started. And the great news for you, if you've got no idea what I'm actually saying, all the slides are in English. So there is a considerable focus on cyber for a number of reasons. Use of the internet in Australia grew by 23% last year. Cyber is a top 10 risk faced by business today. Cyber events have the potential to put a business out of business. And in fact, PwC, the global accounting firm, announced yesterday that their analysis suggests that cyber is the most systemic concern for insurers, reinsurers, and clients. And this is the first time cyber has topped the list. So it just gives you an insight as to the risk that cyber faces. Every organization relies on digital in some way, whether it is to communicate, to transact, or to compete. Virtually every business holds their client details in a digital database. Every industry is at risk. Criminals don't care what industry your clients operate in. If they can monetize an attack, then that industry is at risk. Data breaches and cyber events are not an IT security problem. Technology may be the enabler. However, the consequences are all about how the business responds. Data breaches are a business problem. The operational impact of a cyber event has a very large impact on a business, which we'll talk more about today. There's no such thing as an impenetrable system. How many times has a client said they don't need cyber insurance because their IT consultant has told them their IT system is up to the challenge? Aaron will provide you with some interesting insights into the criminal activity occurring in Australia today. And compromise is expensive. Research tells us that a data breach in Australia costs on average $139 a client record. When you consider how many customers your clients have, you'll start to realize very quickly that cyber event remediation is a very expensive business. This cost is only going to increase once you move into the new mandatory data breach reporting scheme next February, which Colin will talk about a bit more. For these reasons, cyber insurance has evolved to be part of the risk management process to assist businesses recover from cyber events. Let's now look at the frequency and impact of cyber events. These stats give you an insight into what cyber events are happening in Australia today. These stats are from the Australian Federal Government's Cyber Security Centre. And interestingly, the Australian stats are also reflected in Emergence's claims experience, where we're seeing a lot of activity in the ransomware and phishing attacks, which Jeff will talk about later. On the impact side, 82% of businesses who experience a successful cyber attack experience additional costs, whether they're management being distracted from running the business, increased costs of working, or external costs such as IT forensics, marketing costs, legal costs, public relations, or crisis management costs. So, as you can see, cyber threats remain ever present and are increasing at a dramatic rate. So that gives you an insight into what's happening in Australia from a cyber threat perspective. I would like to move on to analysing cyber attacks in Australia, courtesy of Verizon Australia. Verizon is one of the world's leading companies providing global solutions in security, IT forensics, and managed security. Verizon has managed over 100,000 cyber attack investigations and brings an enormous amount of thought leadership to how criminals operate. Emergence are proud to have Verizon as one of their global partners. They have played an important role in developing the Emergence cyber offering over the last few years and are part of the 24/7 incident response team. Representing Verizon today is Aaron Sharp, who is their cybersecurity practice leader in Australia. Aaron has been with Verizon for over 10 years, leading teams that have assisted clients in financial, telecommunications, utilities, and government industries to improve their cybersecurity capabilities. Aaron holds a first-class honours Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Technology in Sydney, and I'll hand you over to Aaron now to talk about cyber attack patterns by industry.
Thank you, Jerry, and good morning, everybody. As Jeffrey mentioned, I'm Aaron from Verizon. One of the things that people may not be aware of is the security research that Verizon has been conducting for a number of years now. The culmination of that is our annual data breach investigation report, or DBIR. You can see on the screen some statistics from this year's report, but I just thought I'd share a little bit of insight about the purpose behind the report, why we did it in the first place. Our CTO 10 years ago was actually a medical doctor. He actually invented the antivirus and he sold it to Peter Norton. And as a medical doctor, there's this concept in medical practice of evidence-based medicine. So really what we wanted to do in security was take away opinions and rumor and get down to some real data that people can make evidence-based, risk-based decisions on. And that was why the DBIR was born. So if we fast forward 10 years, you can see that we've got a number of contributors from around the globe covering law enforcement such as London Metropolitan Police, Dutch high-tech crime, a number of CERT organisations. And if you think about it, for those kind of organisations to contribute data to us is a large amount of trust. And we're very fortunate and very proud that organisations are, have that trust in us to present this data. So the real point of this isn't the opinion of Verizon. This is real world security incident and breach data. And I'm just going to take you through some of the findings, and you'll find that it actually lines up quite closely with some of the stats that Jeff just showed, because what we find is cyber is global. There are no real boundaries. So really, if you haven't suffered a data breach, you've either been incredibly lucky or very well prepared. And what we find is most organizations don't really start thinking about a data breach until it happens to them. Right? So one of the core messages we'd like to get across is start preparing now. A bit of an Australian phrase is "she'll be right, mate," and a lot of organizations take that approach. They don't think it's going to happen to them until it does. There's been some well-publicized security incidents and breaches lately, the most recent being the Equifax breach in the US. and also, you know, the WannaCries and NotPetchers and whatnot. You know, these things are real, right? This isn't a hypothetical thing. This is a massive economy, and we see it right across the board. What we find is it's often opportunistic. So these, the motivation of the attackers is primarily financial, right? So the Hollywood would like to make you think that it's all about other countries trying to get secrets from other countries, but that's not what we find. In fact, well over 85% of attacks are motivated by financial gain. And it's opportunistic. So it's not targeted. It's people trolling, phishing, trying to get a foothold to get financial gain. And increasingly, it's not just about big companies. We quite often read in the press about those big breaches, but what we're seeing is well over 61% of breaches, well over 50% are for organisations of 1,000 employees or below. And this is actually a marked increase over the last couple of years that we've seen a real big uptick in smaller organisations targeted by these organised crime gangs. The other thing that we find is most organisations just aren't prepared. I know Jeff's going to talk in a bit of detail about business email compromise, but that's, you know, really all about phishing primarily, what we call, you know, attacking people, right? 1 in 14 users fell for phishing, and what we've seen in major phishing campaigns is, you know, within 2 minutes of a phishing campaign, the first click-through comes through. It's from a business point of view for the criminals, it's a very efficient way of making money because the barrier to entry to sending, you know, 1 million opportunistic emails is very, very low. And the reason why they keep doing it is because it keeps working. People keep clicking on those phishing emails and they're making money. I find that middle one quite staggering, that a quarter of people were duped more than once in a phishing campaign. So, you know, awareness, training is quite critical when it comes to people. And the other major vector that we see is around passwords, with either stolen or easily guessed passwords used in well over 50% of data breaches. So one of the things that Verizon did in the data breach report this year is to really focus on industries, because what we found through our research is that there really is distinct threats by different industries. So I'm just going to take you through a few examples. Don't have time, unfortunately, to get into the details of every industry, but please go see the report for any industry of interest. So if you have a look at the left-hand column, that represents security incidents, and on the right, data breaches. Now, the difference between those two is the security incident is we know something has happened, but we can't confirm that data has actually been disclosed or compromised. Whereas on the right, it is a confirmed compromise of data. So we look at both data sets. So if we just focus in on the right-hand side set of data, which is the confirmed breaches, you can see the industries across the top. And then as you come down, you can start seeing the different attack patterns at the top, the actions that were taken, and the assets impacted. And it's a heat map. So as the color gets darker, it's a higher percentage of those types. So if we just look at a couple of industries that I think are interesting, The healthcare sector, I find interesting because there's a lot of miscellaneous errors and misuse, otherwise known as people making mistakes. But there's a high percentage in that industry for data breaches, and that could be anything from people accidentally emailing data they shouldn't, to a laptop being lost that has data on it that then gets disclosed. Another interesting thing that isn't actually on here about the healthcare industry is that it's the only industry that we examined that actually had a higher prevalence of people from inside the organisation disclosing data more often than outside attackers. It's actually the other way around for every other industry. And when you drill into it, it's actually the sticky beak factor. People in the healthcare sector are accessing data because they can, right? So you need to have a think about the motivation behind the attackers and why people would access data, whether it's for financial gain, which is the vast majority, but there are differences between the industry, such as healthcare, where there's different motivations, and therefore you need to take different steps to protect that data. Manufacturing is also interesting because it has a high percentage of cyber espionage, right? That is one of the industries where they are targeted, and it's usually to steal IP. The rest of the industries are a bit of a mixed bag, but as you can see, point of sale for accommodation, attacking web services of financial institutions who have a big investment in digital platforms. It really doesn't come as a big surprise if you step back and have a look at the nature of the different businesses within those different sectors to see where they're being attacked and what the motivation is. So really the key point behind all of this data is if you've got some data that behind who is motivated to attack a particular sector, what techniques and what patterns, you've got some chance to actually take a prioritized approach to defending those. So in 2014, we identified 9 basic attack patterns, and today, still 88% of all breaches fall within those basic patterns. What that means is it gives organisations half a chance to spend scarce security resources well to try and prevent breaches occurring. So just a few quick takeaways. Some practical things that you can do. Be vigilant. I mean, it sounds a little bit obvious, but I mentioned earlier that a lot of organisations don't actually put a lot of thought into what impact a cyber attack or breach might have on their organisation until it happens to them, right? So actually thinking about it, putting some forethought into it is a good start. Make people your first line of defence. We're going to hear from some of the other speakers about how people can be a weak link. There's also some really good examples out in industry where people have been turned into human sensors and are actually contributing positively to the security posture of organisations. So let's not be too negative on people. Let's try and get their awareness up so that they become a real asset. Only keep data if you need to have that data for business purposes, right? I know some of the other speakers will reinforce this point, but if you don't need to have data, don't hold it. Patch promptly. That means when Microsoft or Oracle or Adobe or whoever you're using tells you there's a patch available, install that patch as soon as you can. Right? Listen to your IT providers and do patch, because unpatched systems are a major and easy way for attackers to get in. If you must hold sensitive data, encrypt it. Once again, your IT providers should be able to assist you on how to actually do that. It basically means that even if the data is stolen, they can't access the details. Use two-factor authentication. We talked about the weak or stolen passwords being used in over 50%. Two-factor authentication can defeat that quite easily. And for those that aren't familiar with that term, a lot of people might use, net banking or whatever from their bank, and you get sent a code when you try and do something. That's two-factor authentication. So it's basically something in addition to your username and password. And finally, don't forget about physical security. If someone can walk in and steal a laptop or a server and get access to that data, then all of these good logical controls that we've spoken about, have no effect. So look, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to me. For those of you that are interested in some more data, there's a lot more data in the DBIR report. Please feel free to check it out, and I'll hand back over to Jerry now. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, for your insights into what is happening at an industry level. I strongly recommend you talk to clients about Aaron's quick takeaways there. Some of those simple things can make a big difference. Now that we've had a greater understanding of what sort of attacks are happening at an industry level, we would now like to share with you Emergence insight from a claims perspective. Emergence Incident Response Solution has managed many cyber events over the last few years. Management of those claims gives us an insight into the logistical issues of managing cyber claims and is an invaluable source of knowledge which we feed back into the underwriting process, which allows us to address trends and exposures at an underwriting level. Sharing his insights today is Jeff Gonlin. Jeff is the head of underwriting and product development for Emergence and is the architect of the new Emergence wording and pricing methodology. Jeff has over 35 years of insurance and reinsurance experience, having worked for General Re in the US, Europe, and Australia. He joined Emergence last year as the head of underwriting. I can say with absolute confidence that Jeff is one of those rare people who can actually challenge me in a talking contest, and that's a big call. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jerry. Anybody who's been to a cyber conference or maybe has spoken with reinsurers, will, whenever you're talking about cyber, inevitably, the idea of cyber Armageddon or some sort of accumulation, as the reinsurers love to call it, will come into play. It's in the news. Hollywood loves this sort of thing. There's a lot of talk, some of it very serious, and there's some legitimate concern about the inevitability of some major cyber event of catastrophic proportions where critical infrastructure gets affected. The power grid goes out, the telcos, communications networks, transport's down, chemical plants, dams, nuclear power stations, all get targeted. But I don't really worry about it. And it's not that the danger isn't real. Floods and earthquakes and typhoons are real. So is the cyber cataclysm. My brother lives in Florida, in Tampa, and we've been following that very closely. If you have a cyber event, it's not the sort of thing that you can follow in the same way. We have seen recently WannaCry and then the NotPetya that really made global news. I assume everybody's heard about that. But let's not get distracted by that. What I worry about is really at the other end of the scale. It's the literally millions of cyber attacks that are launched against businesses every single day. It doesn't make the news headlines, but it's more costly and more pernicious. I was fortunate to hear Clive Lyons, the Deputy Director of the Australian Signals Directorate, speak recently about the Australian cyber risk landscape. What keeps him awake at night, I wondered. Surely it must be the imminent cyber Armageddon. He mentioned three categories. One is hacktivists like Anonymous, and he says, you know, these guys are really just more or less a nuisance. The other is cyber espionage and state-sponsored hacking, and Aaron mentioned about the threat to manufacturers of espionage, but as far as the state espionage, he says, you know, those guys aren't a problem. They're there, but they remain quiet. They don't want you to. They don't want to disturb things. You know, they just want to sit back and watch. The real biggest threat he felt came from organized crime. If you look at the things like Bitcoin and the dark web and IT today, it's just supercharged what criminals can achieve, making cybercrime what he called the crime of our age. There are a lot of different estimates out there, but they're all big, I think. The cybercrime cost an estimated $450 billion last year, and this really shocked me. It's estimated the effects of it could hit the $2 trillion mark by 2019. Now, that's not far away. That's a very big number by any measure. Some, would say that really the problem is the cybercrime is being professionalized, that they're getting really good at it. And I would argue that maybe the opposite is happening, because you no longer need to have really strong technical skills. You can rent ransomware, or you can find hackers for hire. You can rent malware by the hour or by the day. Typical arrangement might involve giving a 30% cut to the malware provider. Google this and see, and you'll see. If you ever want to get out of insurance or broking, and you got a criminal bend, it's never been a better time. You can get the denial of service attacks available for hire. Put out a tender, just like you're building a garage. You'll get lots of offers. Clive threw out another line that really shocked me. We all remember the census debacle and how this denial of service attack took effect. He estimates that a census size disruption probably costs you about $50 to $100. Now, Jerry mentioned earlier that cyber attacks are a business issue, not a technology problem. And I would shorten that to say that cyber attacks are just a business. So what can we say about the losses? Really the big winner of the year here is ransomware. Australia, despite being the most litigious country in Australasia, is still really dominated by first-party loss. And given that ransomware is what's driving this, it's not surprising. Now, earlier this year, Forbes magazine ran an article. It's titled 2016 saw an insane rise in the number of ransomware attacks. Ransomware instances have grown from 3.2 million in 2014 up to 3.8 in 2015 and 638 million in 2016. That's 167 times the amount, not 167% increase, but times. That's from a SonicWall 2017 recent report. And the payoff's grown also into the billions. You might wonder who's actually paying this stuff, but it's Australians. Gold for the Aussies. Malwarebytes did a survey of ransomware readiness and willingness to pay. And geez, we topped the list, despite advice that you don't want to pay the ransom, you don't want to make yourself a mark. It shouldn't come as any surprise then that demands are also increasing. Whereas we used to see, demands for $300, $500, now they're into the thousands. And I know personally of a demand here locally for $17,000 against an SME. At the very sharp end, I read of a Korean conglomerate that faced a $1 million ransom. So, just-in-time production is also being targeted, as well as hospitals. Anybody that's really time-sensitive. And you just do the math. I think it was a Toyota transmission plant that had just-in-time production. they got hit. You know, you can calculate if it's going to take you 2 days to restore, and what's the value of your production? Geez, we can probably extract, you know, X amount from that, and that's exactly what's going on. And you might think, okay, if it's just reasonable, if it's, you know, a couple $100, just be pragmatic about it and pay. Some have the mistaken notion of that that's the end of it. You may or may not get the key. Your files may or may not be restored. Even if they are, it's not the end of the story because your system has been compromised. You still have to give it a health check and make sure that the malware is not lurking in the background. There's a risk of becoming a victim in the future then, obviously. Business email compromise is now starting actually to overtake some of the ransomware. It's a shifting landscape. You know, business email compromise is the number of events is increasing, and you know the payoffs generally there are higher as well. It's maybe a little bit more difficult than the ransomware, but you know there are proven techniques, and that is that's the quick number 2 behind ransom. What else can we say about losses? Well, the first party response really dominates, but I think we can expect to see a shift after the notification kicks in. There will still be notification costs, which are first party, of course, but and you know there's the time and reputation cost because your business will now you know that breach will become public, and it's a matter of the confidence and trust of your customers. But this may offer fertile ground for litigation, even possibly class actions. We've been spared that so far in Australia, and you know it's not because we haven't had breaches, but because there was no obligation to report them, and so firms actually didn't. So that whole reputational risk and the notification cost is going to have to be built into to the whole equation and funded somehow. What do you tell your customers? You know, if you look at product recall as an analogous type of exposure, you know, some of those are handled well and some not. And the key here really is to be well prepared, to have a disaster recovery plan, and to have you know things ready to go when that eventuality strikes. You should review your policy limits and your coverage. Look at indemnity periods, for example. How long do they run? When do they stop? Is it as soon as your system is functioning, or is it once your revenues return to normal? I'm not going to dwell on SMEs being at risk. There are plenty of stats on that. It's just a fact of life. Look at the Verizon numbers. Some studies have looked at insiders versus outsiders in terms of the source of the problem. Looking at the types of claims we're having, ransomware and business email compromise and phishing, I would rather characterize it as insiders unwittingly helping outsiders. There's been talk about the increased sophistication of attacks, and I think it's not necessarily a technical sophistication, although that's happening. What's happening is that the human element's being involved here. You know, emails and other attacks are being combined with follow-up phone calls, and people are getting duped into doing things that, if they were vigilant, they perhaps would not be duped into. If you want to decrease the likelihood of claim, that old adage, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Aaron offered some good advice in terms of patching, backup, training staff, disaster recovery plan, and business continuity plans are all friends that are worth investing in. If we go back to WannaCry for just a moment, it came and it went, and it didn't really hit many in Australia. So doesn't that show that we're not at risk? Well, there were about 300,000 machines globally, and only 10 real cases, serious cases in Australia. But we actually got lucky, and we were very diligent. There were a lot of IT professionals in government, at the telcos, some of the major companies. They do monitor global traffic. They did spot it. And as one of them put it, a lot of hardworking IT professionals spent a very busy weekend hardening our defenses. So we saw it coming, and actually a lot of that was blocked. It wasn't much of a success financially, the WannaCry, but it was more about flexing muscles and showing what's possible. Some would attribute it to North Korea, testing the platform and demonstrating what's possible. We've seen some other examples as well: election meddling, the fake news, Ukraine, power grid, etc. I think there's another motive that is evolving here as well. Less about grabbing money, more about demonstrating power. It doesn't mean that financial motive is going away, not at all. It just means that we've got additional threat actors out there to be concerned about. Are you worried about the big Armageddon? Well, it's good for Hollywood, but to get back to the real world, back to the Florida hurricanes, you could sit there and wonder whether climate change is behind it, or you could do as my brother did and make sure that you have 150-mile-an-hour protection, hurricane-proof windows and doors in your house. And I think you need to do the equivalent from a cyber standpoint, and you'll be in good stead then when the winds do blow.
Thank you, Jeff, for your insights into what developments you're seeing from a claims perspective. I thought it was a nice touch that you didn't use the whole 60 minutes, so thank you for that. I want to move on from the present and talk about how the legislative landscape is changing for your clients. In February of this year, the federal government passed legislation which will introduce a mandatory data breach reporting scheme into Australia. This is a critical development in Australian business responsibilities to advise clients and customers if their personal identifiable information has been compromised. To understand this issue in more detail, I'd like to welcome Colin Pawsey of Spark Helmore Lawyers. Spark Helmore have been associated with Emergence since its beginning in 2014. They've played an important role in developing the Emergence cyber wording over the last few years and are part of our 24/7 incident response team. From Spark Helmore today, we've one of their senior specialist insurance lawyers, Colin Pawsey. Colin was admitted as a solicitor in 1978. His experience is unique. For many years as a lawyer in private practice, he has advised insurers on product development and has conducted litigation in all jurisdictions in Australia. Colin has also been involved in developing the Spark Helmore cyber insurance capability. I'll hand you over to Colin to give you an insight into the new mandatory reporting environment, which comes into effect next year. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm going to talk today about the Privacy Notifiable Data Breaches Act 2017, which becomes part of the Privacy Act as in from the 22nd of February 2018. I'm going to talk very briefly about who the legislation applies to, what is an eligible breach, what is information, what is serious harm, what to do if you're uncertain about whether or not there has been an eligible data breach, when an entity has to notify, the forms of notification, a hypothetical talking about ransomware, and lastly, I'm going to talk about the impact that an eligible data breach may have upon your business generally. The first thing is, who does the legislation apply to? And the legislation applies to entities which are bound by the Australian Privacy Principles, which is the acronym APP. And that is defined in the legislation as including Australian government agencies, businesses and non-profit organisations with an annual turnover of $3 million, credit reporting bodies, credit providers, entities that hold tax file number details for individuals, private sector health service providers. But it's important also to know who it does not apply to, and that is state or territory government agencies. There is actually privacy legislation or privacy guidelines in most states, it's most probable that a form of mandatory notification will come into most states shortly. But there is also currently in the states, for example, mandatory requirements regarding health information. But at the moment, the amendments to the Privacy Act do not apply to state or government territory agencies. They do not apply to local government. An interesting one is they don't apply to public schools, but of course they apply to private schools. They don't apply to universities, except the ANU, and also to small businesses. So even though a small business is not an entity governed by the Australian privacy principles, it can still also be affected significantly by data breaches. And there are a number of exceptions to that small business rule. And anyone that holds tax file numbers, for example, anyone that holds health information, you're all affected by this legislation. So the crux of the legislation is, what is an eligible data breach? And there are two limbs to determining what is an eligible data breach. The first is there an unauthorised access to or unauthorised disclosure of or loss of the information? That's the first limb. And if that happens, then would a reasonable person conclude that the access or disclosure or loss would be likely to result in serious harm to any of the individuals to whom the information relates? Now, the relevant expressions in there are likely and serious harm. Now, I'll deal with what serious harm is shortly, but if both the first limb and the second limb is satisfied, then there is an eligible data breach. And if there is an eligible data breach, then logically, the information for individuals is at risk. The next question to be asked is, what is information? And in the legislation, information includes personal information, but it also includes credit reporting information, credit eligibility information, and tax file number information. Now, personal information is something that we hear a lot about, and it's actually information which enables someone to identify the individual, or that an individual can be reasonably identified through. And there's some very obvious examples of personal information, such as your name, your date of birth could be an example, your address, your tax file number, your driver's license, your Medicare number, your passport number, any other identification card you hold, your private health insurance card, your health records itself, or even a photo. So what is personal information is significant. And if you think of what I've just said, each of those things, if you add one to another, the more pieces of personal information out there, then the more logical it is that you can be identified. So that is a very important part of this legislation, to understand what is information generally, and particularly what is personal information. Now, there are exceptions to the legislation. There's exceptions regarding security, national security, and other exceptions. But the most logical exception is that you actually determine, or that you act before there is serious harm. And if you can take action once you're aware that there's been access, disclosure, or loss of information, you can take action before a reasonable person would conclude that there's likely to be serious harm, then that is not a notifiable breach and is not an eligible data breach. Now, what is serious harm? I'm asking a lot of questions, but there's a lot of this is new legislation, and believe it or not, serious harm is not actually defined in the legislation. Our guidance here comes from the explanatory memorandum, which was introduced into Parliament when the reading of the bill, which was ultimately passed. And the explanatory memorandum says that serious harm could include serious physical, psychological, emotional, economic, and financial harm, as well as serious harm to reputation and other forms of serious harm that a reasonable person in the entity's position would identify as a possible outcome of the data breach. So it's how long is a piece of string? Serious harm could be anything. It would depend very much upon the type of information, the individual, and so forth. So the actual assessment of serious harm is quite a significant task in determining whether there has been or hasn't been an eligible data breach. Now, Section 26WG of the legislation sets out matters that a reasonable person should consider, but they don't actually tell you what serious harm is. The best guide is that which is contained in the explanatory memorandum. And of course, if there's been, or you believe there's been access to or loss of information, what do you do if you're not sure if there's been an eligible data breach? And Section 26WH says that an entity must carry out a reasonable and expeditious assessment as to whether there are reasonable grounds to believe there has been an eligible data breach. And they must take all steps to complete that assessment within 30 days of them first becoming aware. So there is a period of time in which you can consider this, but the minute you believe there has been an eligible data breach, then once we get to 22nd of February next year, then that is notifiable. So what happens if an eligible data breach is notifiable? The entity that's holding the information, that's had the information lost or accessed, must prepare a statement and give a copy of the statement to the Commissioner of the Australian Information Office. The statement must set out the things set out on the screen, but it's quite important that we go through these things. It must actually set out the identity and contact details of the entity that has been affected. And that's really important so people can contact you and talk about what's happened. You've got to be honest and set out a description of the eligible data breach that you have reasonable grounds to believe has happened. You've got to talk about the kinds of information concerned and what you've done about the information. It's very important that in these notices you talk about what you've done, but equally as important, you should be making recommendations about what steps the individuals whose information has been lost or accessed, what steps they can take. Now, the obvious is you notify individuals, and that notification is in writing, so those individuals at risk receive a notification. But if you can't identify all the individuals, or you don't have the addresses, but you have other identifying factors which classifies as personal information, then in certain circumstances, to adequately notify, you may be required to publish a notice on your website, or you may be required to publish generally the old notice in the newspaper, which is something from the past. Now, we've heard everyone talk today about ransomware. So you lose access to your system because of ransomware. You then regain access. So there has been unauthorised access, but is unauthorised access likely to result in serious harm to individuals to whom the information relates? And that's what you've got to identify. So if there's been a ransomware attack and the information has been accessed, and then you regain access to the information, you have to assess whether it's likely to result in serious harm to individuals. Now, if the answer to that is yes, as a consequence of the act of ransomware, there may be serious harm to individuals, or it's likely there may be serious harm to individuals, then you must notify. If the answer is no, then there's no obligation to notify. Now, the answer is you're unsure, then as I've said before, you have 30 days in which to carry out a reasonable and expeditious assessment of whether or not there has been serious harm. Now, lastly, I want to talk about impact on businesses. This is a brave new world. Businesses that may have previously ignored a data breach can no longer ignore a data breach. The time to enhance cybersecurity is not on the 22nd of February next year. The time to do that is now. It's also the time to manage access to data, which Aaron actually spoke about. It's also a time to ensure that your disaster recovery plan or your business continuity plan is updated to deal with the possibility of an eligible data breach. Now, an insurance response may ultimately be your only protection, but it's important you understand what is my protection and what will I do in the event of an eligible data breach. The other thing to think about is, can you afford the cost of notification? I mean, insurance is a marvellous solution for that. Of course, if you don't comply with the Privacy Act and you don't act as you should act, if there's been an eligible data breach, then you can be liable for quite significant penalties for failure to comply under the Privacy Act. Again, as been mentioned by Aaron earlier, that the concept of why you hold data becomes more relevant. Think back to what is personal information. All those little pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, only hold what you have to hold. So review and audit what information you do hold and do it now. You also have to manage your external arrangements, which is quite interesting because if you have a contract with anyone externally, it is very, very important that arrangement be managed. Most importantly, manage your people. You can see from Aaron's statistics earlier how vulnerable your people can be. Make them think before they click. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Colin, for that insight into our brave new world next February. Over the last few months, I've been spending a lot of time talking to brokers about Emergence and brokers' understanding of Emergence capabilities. It became obvious to me that there are a number of you that do not realize that Emergence has expanded their coverage, capabilities, and online portal in the last 6 months. So, what's changed? Emergence released a new broader wording in April this year. Emergence has invested heavily in technology. With an expanded question set, the new portal can now write risks up to 75 million, and I'll talk more about that later. Emergence has one of the broadest appetites in the market with the ability to provide solutions for 13,000 occupations, including healthcare, retailers, education, and financial services, just to name a few. We write risks from startups to ASX-listed companies, and in fact, in the last couple of months, we've written 3 ASX-listed companies. We've also got the ability to write schemes, and the security is 100% Lloyd's through Markel, who are the second largest writer of cyber business in the London market. So Emergence are very focused on building the cyber knowledge of the industry, and in particular our broker partners. Cyber is an emerging product which is going to change even further as we move into the new mandatory reporting environment. Based on the experience overseas where mandatory reporting has been introduced, there will be an evolution in terms of cover, pricing, and the management of the accumulation exposure that cyber presents. Therefore, it's important for you as brokers to keep up to date with developments in the cyberspace. Going forward, we're looking to focus more on educating our broker partners through such things as webinars, website blogs, broker presentations, and LinkedIn content. You can build your cyber knowledge by registering your email address on the product page of our website, or you can go to Emergence Insurance on LinkedIn and follow us there. Brokers who have access to the Emergence portal have the ability to quote and bind risks up to 75 million in revenue on policy limits ranging from 250,000 to 10 million. Offline, we can look at risks where clients require up to 20 million policy limits, and these are normally because of contractual requirements. The cover can be tailored to your client's requirements with the multiple deductibles and options for the length of business interruption cover. You can also select additional coverage options to build a cyber program. If any brokers listening today require access to the system, please email info@emergenceinsurance.com.au and request access. For assistance on any cyber-related issues, please feel free to contact any of the Emergence underwriting team or our incident response team. Our incident response solution is managed from Sydney in partnership with Cunningham Lindsay, who are experts in their field and understand the importance of immediately mitigating potential threats to your client's business. The Emergence Insurance Response Team is available 24/7 and manage the claims process on your behalf to minimize the threat and save you time. The team includes IT investigators, forensic accountants, lawyers, public relations, and crisis management consultants. I hope our webinar today has given you a greater understanding of the significant risk that cyber event poses for your clients, the sort of claims that are occurring, the changing legislative environment that will occur next February, and how Emergence can assist you to build cyber solutions. So a number of you have posted questions, and we'll try and deal with some of those now. So Jeff, can I call on you to go through some of the questions?
In the couple of minutes we have, we'll touch on a few. One was whether or not the slide deck will be made available. Jerry tells me yes, it will. And another as to whether the data breach report can be cited or used on a website or linked. Yes, sure, you can use it. We're happy to get the stats out there. Just please give proper attribution as you would any other intellectual property. Let's see, we had a question here in terms of the scope of coverage and about the plethora of policies that are available out there. For non-IT literate people, say it may not be particularly easy to understand which policy will provide coverage for which particular incident when another one won't. Trying to compare covers and understand the differences is difficult. I think that's true on any line of business, cyber especially. Don't go for the cheapest, go for the best. Yes, I would say start with the LMI policy comparisons. For some people they're useful, others find them not useful. That's a good starting point. There's nothing like a good discussion. I think the best is if you can chat with your local underwriter and invite them to present to your brokerage and discuss it live. I think that you reach a much better understanding that way. Let's see. With the availability of virus and malware software in the market, keeping it regularly updated, is that enough to protect yourself? Well, it's a good start, but it's not the end. There are a lot of other measures you can take. Talk with IT security consultants. You can get if you're insured or your firm is interested, you can get security scans and advice. I think there's the different teams, the red team, blue team sort of thing that they'll try to hack your system and try to defend it. There's a one way to well, there are many more measures that you can take and should take, and some of them are right before your eyes. Look at a cyber insurance proposal form. There are several out there, and there's a reason that those questions are asked. They'll be broken into different categories, often as far as network security or about what policies you have in place, whether you have a privacy policy, etc. And if you find yourself not ticking the yes, then you probably have something to work on. That's low-hanging fruit right there. One last one. They said someone wrote and said, "Well, how do I know which policy is best, and or which is the best policy on the market?" I don't think it's a question of which is the best. You have to. It's like an investment. You have to know what you're interested in protecting, and I think brokers have a great role to play here. This is not a policy that should be sold directly online. It's not one to be disintermediated. You want to have an informed, intelligent broker helping you on this, and I think it's a golden opportunity for them to shine.
Thanks for that, Jeff. I promised you we would finish the official webinar in 60 minutes. On behalf of Emergence, Verizon, and Spark Elmore, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join our webinar today. I hope you found it educational and useful in building your own cyber knowledge and giving you the tools to assist in having a more informed conversation with your clients. As I mentioned earlier, all attendees will be entitled to 1 CPD point. We will send out certificates of attendance to the email address you used to register for the event. For those of you who are listening as a group, please email your list of attendees and their email address to info@emergenceinsurance.com.au, and we will arrange for certificates of attendance to be issued to those people as well. As Jeff said, we're also recording the webinar, and we will share this with the registered attendees. We'll be hosting the next webinar in our series in November, so keep an eye out for that. This is the official end of the webinar for those of you who wish to leave. For those of you who wish to stay online to listen to our feedback on other questions lodged by your colleagues, please feel free to stay online. So we'll move to those questions now. A question for Colin. When a client stores client data in the cloud, who has responsibility for advising clients of the personal identifiable information breach under the new data breach scheme?
One of the last things I said, Jerry, was to make sure that you manage your external providers, and one of those could be a cloud provider. So the answer is that whoever holds information and that information is accessed or lost, then they have the responsibility to notify. And that can be, in that case, both the cloud provider and you, who are the entity that actually introduced the information into the system, which is managed in the cloud. So there's a liability on both of you to notify. I'd much prefer the company whose client it is, or the person who actually originally obtained the information. I think it's preferable that they notify, particularly if there is a client nexus. But ultimately, the Office of Information won't care who notifies as long as someone does. But what they don't want is 2 notifications. So at the time of advising the Office of Information, you'd have to, both entities would either independently or jointly advise, but only 1 notice should go out. And if you're ever in doubt, it's the person who brought the information to the system, I think, is the one who should notify.
Colin, I totally agree. So another question, one for Jeff. How much does it cost to fix a ransomware attack?
Well, that depends. You know, a couple of key drivers. You know, for small businesses with less complicated IT, it's going to be less expensive than for large corporations. You would that have more complex IT. You would think, but you know, the larger organization may have a more sophisticated approach in that they have redundant systems, they have backups, and they have measures in place that will allow them to recover very quickly. We've seen where some companies have recovered, you know, within hours of an attack, and where other companies that didn't have backups or not sufficient backups because they got corrupted, ended up losing, you know, a week or a month's or 6 weeks worth of data, and had to reconstruct. So actually, it has less to do with the size of the company. It does have something to do with the number of records you have, I think. But the most important thing is that it has to do with whether you've got backups and securities and redundancies in your system that you can rely on.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Another question, there was discussion about business email compromise. Can Emergence provide cover for these sort of scenarios?
It's covered.
How?
How? Read the policy, Jerry. It is covered. Yes, it is covered.
So the important point is there's optional extensions to the cover, of which one is cyber theft, and you get a choice as to what sublimits you want for that cover. There's also the option to provide contingent business interruption cover and cover for tangible property cover that is impacted by a cyber event.
Yeah, there was a question here whether we're able to provide third-party crime. Yes, we are. That's an optional coverage, as Jerry mentioned. Related to the legislation, there's a question of why the legislation only applies excess of 3 million in turnover when so many events have come from SME businesses. And I'll defer to Canberra on that one. Unless Colin's shaking his head. Yes, we don't make the legislation. We just kind of react to it.
But one point about that, Jeff, is legislation is a compromise, and
Yep.
this legislation has been tried to get through the Parliament since 2010. This is the third bill that has actually been tabled. The other two couldn't get through the Senate. So it's a case of what do the government have to do to reach a common ground, and it's for one of those examples will be the 3 million limit. You know, there's interestingly there was a late attempt by the Greens to cut that 30-day reporting requirement to the Privacy Commissioner down to 15 days, but that didn't get up.
Yeah, you got to strike a balance because you don't want to saddle you know, the coffee shop on the corner, you know, with a loyalty program with really onerous you know, requirements. There were a couple of questions on here about the indemnity period and how do you evaluate that. Well, there are two sides to that, and I think, you know, picking an indemnity period for any particular client is probably beyond the scope of a quick answer here. But the other aspect is, you know, look at how the indemnity period applies. Some policies will say, you know, it's a fixed period. It could be shorter, it could be longer. I've seen anywhere from 7 days up to you know, 120 days, or Emergence offers up to 365 days. Look at when it ends. Does it end when your system is functional, when it's fully functional? Does it key into you know, when your business is returned to normalcy and when your revenues have recovered? So there are different versions on this. Read the policy and determine, I think, first, you know, when you want it to end or how you want it to end, whether it takes into account recovery of your business revenues. And then I think, you know, the decision as to how long a period is, again, that's the next step, but it's beyond the scope, I think, of.
Yeah, but I think one point about that, Jeff, is look at the type of client that you're trying to come up with a cyber solution for. If you've got an e-retailer and their business is 100% online, the reality is if they're ransomware, then they will need to have that website back up and running in a very, very fast period. Otherwise, they don't have a business. So is it appropriate for that sort of business to have 365 days indemnity period? Probably not. Something around 30 to 60 days is probably more reasonable for that sort of business. So think about your clients. I
have possibly one last question here. If a breach occurs, you're making an assessment regarding the privacy notifications. Are we prepared to assist in the decision-making process, or you know, I suppose the whole process in deciding how or if or when to give some notification? Yes, we are. That's part of what we do. We've had discussions with clients already in cases. You know, you may be required, even without this legislation, in certain cases, to give some notice, depending on your industry or situation. When the law comes in, certainly we're prepared to do that. That's part of what we offer.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. That's all the questions we have time for. We will try and reply to other questions that have come through the webinar, and we'll email the responses to those. Thank you again for your time, and we hope you found it educational and useful in building your own cyber knowledge. I want to again thank our speakers today for their efforts in bringing the webinar together, and I'll say goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.